In the heart of a city that never seemed to sleep, there was a rhythm to everything. The morning began with the deep groan of the first subway train pulling out of the station, sound that vibrated through the concrete foundations of buildings tall and small. It was followed by the symphony of a million small alarms, the hiss of coffee machines, and the hurried shuffle of feet on cold pavement. The city breathed, and its breath was a constant, rushing wind of people going somewhere, needing to be somewhere, always moving forward. Amidst this relentless current, there was a man who was perfectly still. He was a pause in the music, a silent note in a chaotic song. To the thousands of people who passed him every day, he was just part of the scenery, like a lamppost or a mailbox. He was a figure in a worn, heavy overcoat, the color of a dusty road, his frayed cuffs and missing button telling a story of many seasons. His hair, once a dark and respectable color, was now a stormy mix of gray and white, often unkempt by the wind. He stood on the same corner every morning, just as the sky began to lighten from a deep, starless black to a soft, bruised purple. He never moved from his spot, never shifted his weight impatiently. He simply stood, his hands tucked deep into his pockets, his gaze fixed on some distant point down the street, as if he were waiting for a ghost only he could see. People flowed around him like water around a stone. A young woman, her face illuminated by the glow of her phone, would walk right past him, never once looking up. A man in a crisp suit, barking orders into a Bluetooth earpiece, would sidestep him with an annoyed grunt, annoyed by the obstacle in his path. They didn't see him. They saw a shape, a shadow, an inconvenience. But if anyone had taken a moment, just a single second, to really look at him, they would have seen more. They would have seen the profound stillness in his posture, a stillness that wasn't lazy, but deliberate. They would have noticed his shoes scuffed and worn down at the heel, but clean, as if he had made an effort to wipe them off. Most of all, they would have seen his eyes. They were a pale, washed-out blue, the color of the sky just before a storm. But it wasn't their color that was striking. It was the look within them. It was a look of such immense, crushing weight that it seemed to pull at the very corners of his face. His eyes held a landscape of loss, a vast, empty space where something used to be. He didn't look sad in the way a person looks sad when they've had a bad day. This was deeper, more ancient. It was the look of someone who had traveled to the end of his own personal world and found nothing there. His daily walk to this corner was a slow, meandering journey. He would emerge from one of the many narrow alleyways that branched off the main streets, appearing as if from thin air. He walked with a steady, unhurried pace, his shoulders slightly hunched against a cold that no one else seemed to feel. He watched the city wake up with a quiet, detached interest. He saw the baker arrive, yawning to unlock his shop. He saw the street sweepers with their big, grumbling machines, pushing the debris of the previous day into neat piles. He saw the first school buses, their yellow lights cutting through the morning gloom, carrying children who were still half asleep. He saw all of this, but he didn't seem to be a part of it. He was an observer, a ghost from another time, walking through a world that had moved on without him. His destination was always the same: a small, cheerful-looking bakery called the Daily Crumb. Its window was always filled with golden croissants, fruit-topped pastries, and crusty loaves of bread that promised warmth and comfort. A painted sign above the door, shaped like a smiling loaf of bread, welcomed customers in. It was a place of warmth and sweetness, a stark contrast to the man's silent, gray world. He would stop across the street from the bakery and wait. He never stood too close, never blocked the entrance. He kept his distance, a respectful observer. He would wait for about 10 minutes, a silent statue in the waking city. Then, the owner of the bakery would come out. She was a woman in her late 50s, with flour often dusting her apron and her cheeks. Her name was known to few, but her kindness was known to many. She would step outside to put up the daily specials on a chalkboard, or to sweep the sidewalk in front of her shop. And every single time, her eyes would immediately find him. There was an unspoken ritual between them. She would finish her small task, wipe her hands on her apron, and then look directly at him. He would meet her gaze, and for a brief moment, the world would fall away. In that look, there was no pity, no judgment. There was just a quiet, shared understanding. Then he would begin to walk slowly across the street. He moved with a strange dignity, his back straighter than it was when he was standing alone. He would stop a few feet away from her, close enough to talk, but not close enough to be a threat. He would never smile. His face remained a mask of quiet sorrow. But he would always nod, a slight, almost imperceptible dip of his head. It was a gesture of respect. Then he would speak. His voice was a surprise. It was not the rough, gravelly voice one might expect. It was quiet, clear, and had a deep, resonant tone that seemed to come from the very pit of his stomach. It was a voice that, in another life, might have been used for giving speeches or singing songs. But now it was barely a whisper, a fragile sound in the noisy morning air. "May I please have a piece of bread?" he would ask. He never asked for money. He never asked for anything else. Just bread. Every day the same question, asked with the same quiet politeness. The woman never hesitated. She would nod, her expression softening. "Of course," she would say, her voice warm and gentle. "Wait here just one moment." She would disappear back into the bakery, the little bell above the door chiming her departure. She would always return with the best loaf she had. Not a day-old one, or one with a slight burn. She would bring him a warm, crusty loaf, straight from the cooling rack, wrapped carefully in wax paper. It was a loaf that she would have been proud to sell to any of her regular customers. She would hand it to him, and their fingers would sometimes brush for a fraction of a second. His hand would be cold, hers warm. He would take the loaf with both hands, as if it were something incredibly precious. He would look her in the eyes, and in his pale blue eyes, a flicker of something would appear. It wasn't happiness. It was too deep for that. It was gratitude, pure and profound. It was a look that said more than words ever could. He would nod again, a little more deeply this time. "Thank you," he would say. And then he would turn and walk away. He would not eat the bread right away. He would carry it carefully, cradling it in his arms like a baby. He would walk to a nearby park, to a specific wooden bench that was partly hidden by an old oak tree. It was his bench. He would sit down, the morning sun filtering through the leaves and dappling his worn coat. Only then would he unwrap the bread. The scent of warm yeast and baked wheat would fill the air around him. He would break off a piece and eat it slowly, methodically, chewing each bite as if he were trying to memorize its taste. He wouldn't look around. He wouldn't watch the people. He would just look at the bread in his hands, his entire world shrinking to that simple, life-giving sustenance. When he was finished, he would carefully fold the wax paper and tuck it into his pocket. He would stand up, brush any stray crumbs from his coat, and then, just as quietly as he arrived, he would disappear back into the anonymous flow of the city. He would leave behind only a faint scent of fresh bread on the morning air, and a lingering question in the mind of the bakery owner. Who would watch him go, wondering about the story of the man who asked for nothing but bread? The man's days fell into a rhythm as predictable as the rising and setting of the sun. He would appear with the first light, receive his bread with a silent nod, and vanish into the city's sprawling maze. His path was always the same, a quiet pilgrimage through streets that were slowly coming to life. He walked past the newspaper stands, the smell of fresh ink, a sharp, clean scent in the morning air. He walked past the construction sites, the rhythmic clang of hammers and the shouts of workers, a stark contrast to his own silence. He was a constant in a world of change, a silent observer watching the city's daily drama unfold. One part of his journey, however, always held a strange kind of pull. It was a small, elegant shop nestled between a bustling cafe and a modern office building. Its name was painted in graceful gold letters on the window. Melody Makers. Unlike the other shops, with their bright lights and sale signs, this one was always calm, almost reverent. Its large, spotless window was a stage for a single, magnificent object, a grand piano. It was a gleaming black monster of a thing, all polished lacquer and graceful curves. It sat in the center of the window display, angled just so, as if waiting for an audience. Its lid was propped open, revealing the pristine white and black keys and the complex web of strings and hammers inside. Every day for months, the man had given it nothing more than a passing glance. It was a world away from his own, a symbol of a life he could no longer imagine. The piano represented beauty, art, and a kind of refined joy that felt like a distant dream. To him, it was just another piece of scenery, like the ornate lamppost next to it, or the fancy cars that parked outside. He would look at it for a second, maybe two, and then move on. His mind focused on the simple, immediate goal of the bakery and the warmth of the bread. But one Tuesday, the sky decided to change the script. The morning had started gray and heavy, a thick blanket of clouds pressing down on the city. Then, around mid-morning, the sky broke open. It wasn't a gentle rain. It was a sudden, violent downpour. The drops were fat and heavy, splatting against the pavement with a force that sent up little explosions of water. The city's rhythm instantly changed. The hurried footsteps turned into a frantic scramble for cover. People huddled under awnings, opened umbrellas with a sudden whoosh, or ducked into the nearest doorway. The sound of the city was muffled, replaced by the drumming of rain on rooftops, the gurgle of water in drains, and the hiss of tires on wet asphalt. The man, caught without an umbrella, was soaked in seconds. The heavy fabric of his coat became a cold, clammy weight. Water dripped from his hair onto his forehead, and he felt a chill seep into his bones. He looked around for a place to shelter, his eyes scanning the buildings. Most doorways were already crowded with other people, chattering and shaking out their wet clothes. He didn't want to be near them. He wanted his own space, his own silence. And then he saw it. The doorway of Melody Makers. It was deep and set back from the street, offering a perfect refuge from the storm. And, most importantly, it was empty. He walked towards it, his shoes squelching with every step. He stepped into the doorway, and the world immediately became quieter. The roar of the rain was still there, but it was now a distant, muffled sound, like listening to a seashell. He was in his own little bubble, a dry island in a sea of wet chaos. He leaned back against the cool glass of the shop window, the coldness a small comfort against his wet back. And for the first time, he was truly looking at the piano. It was no longer a fleeting image in his peripheral vision. It was right there, just on the other side of the glass, so close he could almost touch it. The rain-streaked window distorted its reflection, making it look like it was underwater. A beautiful black creature sleeping at the bottom of a deep, dark lake. The shop's interior lights were on, casting a soft, warm glow on the instrument. It made the black lacquer shine with a deep, lustrous sheen. He could see every detail, the intricate carvings on the legs, the sharp, clean lines of the keys, the 3 brass pedals below, shining like little golden flowers. He found himself staring at his own reflection in the polished surface of the piano side. It was a distorted, wavy image, a ghostly figure superimposed over the elegant instrument. He saw his own face, pale and gaunt, with its tangled gray hair and its perpetually sad eyes. He saw his worn, wet coat. And he saw the piano, perfect and pristine. The contrast was so stark, it was like looking at 2 different worlds colliding. And then it happened. A memory, sharp and sudden as a bolt of lightning, shot through his mind. It wasn't a vague feeling. It was a full-blown sensory experience. He was no longer a wet, homeless man in a doorway. He was in a vast concert hall, the air thick with anticipation and the scent of expensive perfume. He was wearing a stiff, formal tuxedo, the velvet of the seat under his fingers smooth and cool. He looked out, and the sea of faces was a blur, but one face stood out, clear and bright. A woman, her hair swept up, a smile on her face that was just for him. Her eyes were shining with pride and love. He could almost hear the thunderous applause, feel the vibration of it in his chest. The memory was so real, so powerful, that it physically hurt. It was a punch to the gut, a reminder of everything he had lost. The music, the applause, the love, the man he used to be. It all came flooding back in a dizzying, painful rush. He felt a tremor start in his hands and travel up his arms. It wasn't from the cold. It was from the memory, from the ghost of his former self that was now staring back at him from the other side of the glass. The piano was no longer just an object. It was a door to his past, a key to a life he had buried so deep he thought it was gone forever. He felt a pull, an undeniable magnetic attraction to it. He had to get closer. He pushed himself away from the window and stood at the very edge of the doorway. The rain still dripping from the roof just inches from his face. He looked at the shop's handle. It was an old-fashioned brass handle, ornate and heavy. It looked cold to the touch. His heart was beating fast, a frantic, unfamiliar rhythm against his ribs. What was he doing? This was crazy. He couldn't go in there. He was a mess. He was wet. He had no money. He would be thrown out. He would be an embarrassment. But the pull was stronger than his fear. The memory of the music, the feel of the keys under his fingers, was a hunger more powerful than his daily need for bread. He took a deep, shaky breath. He looked up and down the street. The rain was still coming down hard. No one was paying any attention to him. Everyone was busy with their own rush to get out of the wet. He was invisible. Slowly, deliberately, he reached out his hand. His fingers were trembling so much he could barely aim for the handle. He expected it to be locked, solid, and unmoving. It would be a sign, a message from the universe to turn back, to go back to his quiet, invisible life. He wrapped his cold, wet fingers around the brass handle. It was just as cold as he had imagined. He pushed down, gently at first. Then, with a little more pressure, there was a soft click. The latch gave way. The door swung inward, just a crack. It was unlocked. The man froze, his hand still on the handle. He was stunned. It felt like a miracle, or a terrible mistake. He hesitated for a long moment, the rain drumming on the pavement behind him, the silent, warm world of the shop beckoning to him from in front. He could smell it now, a faint, sweet scent drifting through the crack in the door. It was the smell of wood polish, old paper, and something else. Something like dust and memories. He took one last look at the empty, rain-swept street, and then he made a decision. He pushed the door open just wide enough for him to slip through and stepped inside. The little bell above the door chimed softly, a single, clear note that hung in the air. He quickly closed the door behind him, shutting out the sound of the rain. The sudden silence was deafening. It was in. The air inside was cool and still. The only light came from the soft spotlights illuminating the instruments and the gray. Rainy light filtering through the front window. The shop was empty. He could see a half-open door at the back, leading to what he assumed was an office or a storage room, but he could hear no sounds from within. He was alone with the music. He stood there for a long time, just breathing, his wet clothes dripping onto the polished wooden floor, leaving a small, dark puddle at his feet. He felt like an intruder, a trespasser in a sacred temple. But the piano didn't seem to mind. It just sat there, waiting. He began to walk towards it, his steps slow and hesitant, as if the floor might give way beneath him. He walked past rows of gleaming trumpets hanging on the wall, past violins resting in their cases like sleeping children. But his eyes were only on the grand piano. He finally reached it, stopping just a foot away. Up close, it was even more magnificent. He could see his own reflection clearly now in the polished black surface, a sad, wet ghost staring back at him. He slowly walked around to the bench, a simple, polished wooden stool that seemed to be waiting for him. He didn't sit down, not yet. He just stood there, looking down at the keys. They were so white, so perfect. 88 keys, black and white, holding the possibility of every song ever written, every emotion ever felt. He raised his right hand. It was still trembling. He brought his fingers closer, so close he could feel the coolness radiating from the ivory. For a long moment, his hand remained frozen in the air, a bridge between the world of silence and the world of sound. The air in the shop was thick with the scent of wood and dust, a scent that seemed to hold the memories of 1,000 songs. His reflection in the polished lacquer of the piano stared back at him, a sad, wet ghost with haunted eyes. He felt a tremor of fear run through him. What if he touched the keys and nothing happened? What if the magic was gone, washed away by years of rain and sorrow? The thought was more terrifying than the thought of being caught. It would mean the last piece of his old self was truly dead. But the pull was too strong. It was a physical ache, a deep hunger in his soul. Slowly, as if moving through thick, invisible water, he lowered his hand. His index finger, dirty and trembling, made contact with the cool, smooth surface of an ivory key. He didn't press it down. He just let it rest there, feeling the texture, the solid reality of it under his skin. It felt both foreign and familiar, like a handshake with a long-lost friend. He took a deep, shaky breath, and then, with the slightest amount of pressure, he pushed down. The sound that came out was not loud. It was a single, clear note, a perfect C that hung in the silent air like a tiny silver bell. It was so pure, so clean, that it seemed to chase away all the shadows in the room. To the man, it was the loudest sound he had heard in years. It was a shock to his system, a jolt of electricity that ran up his arm and straight to his heart. He snatched his hand back as if he had been burned, his eyes wide with a mixture of shock and wonder. The note faded slowly, leaving a silence that was heavier and more meaningful than the one before it. It was a silence that was now filled with possibility. He stared at his hand, then back at the keys. He had done it. He had broken the spell. He felt a strange sensation in his fingers, a tingling, a waking up. It was as if the muscles and nerves in his hands remembered something that his conscious mind had tried to forget. He slowly lowered his hand again, this time with a little more confidence. He placed his fingers on a few keys, his thumb on the white C, his other fingers falling naturally into place on the adjacent white keys. It was a familiar shape, a comfortable posture he had known for most of his life. He hesitated for a second, and then he played a simple C major scale. His fingers were stiff and clumsy at first, like the rusty gears of an old machine that hadn't been turned in a decade. The notes came out uneven, some too loud, some too soft. But they came out. And as he played, something miraculous began to happen. The rust began to flake away. The stiffness in his fingers started to dissolve, replaced by a fluid, graceful motion. His hands, which had been empty and useless for so long, suddenly knew what to do. They moved with a life of their own, a memory etched so deep into his being that not even years of neglect could erase it. The simple scale gave way to a simple melody. It was a tune he remembered from his childhood, a lullaby his mother used to hum. It was a sad, sweet little song, and as he played it, the shop seemed to fill with the ghost of his past. He could almost smell his mother's perfume, feel the warmth of her hand on his forehead. The music was no longer just a series of notes. It was a story. It was his story. As he became more comfortable, the music began to change. It grew more complex, more emotional. It was no longer a simple lullaby. It was a lament, a cry of pure, unadulterated sorrow. The melody wept and moaned, a sound of profound loss that seemed to come from the very depths of his soul. It was the sound of a heart breaking, over and over again. It was the cold, lonely rain on a window pane. It was the empty space in a bed where a loved one used to sleep. He was no longer thinking about what he was playing. He was just feeling. His eyes were closed, his head bent low over the keys, his entire being focused on the music pouring out of him. He was pouring all of his pain, all of his loneliness, all of his regret into the piano. The instrument, which had been a silent, beautiful object, was now alive. Vibrating with his emotions, its voice filling every corner of the small shop. And the music didn't stay inside the shop. It seeped out through the cracks around the door and the large display window. It drifted out into the rain-slicked street, a haunting, beautiful melody that cut through the drumming of the rain and the grumble of traffic. At first, no one noticed. People were too busy rushing, too busy huddled under their umbrellas, their minds filled with their own worries and deadlines. But then, a young woman walking with her head down stopped. She lifted her head, a confused look on her face. Where was that music coming from? It was so beautiful, so sad. She looked around and saw the music shop. She saw the sign, Melody Makers, and through the rain-streaked window, she saw a figure hunched over the piano. She took a step closer, drawn by the sound like a moth to a flame. A man in an expensive suit shouting into his phone walked right past her, but then he too stopped mid-sentence. The music had reached him too. It was a sound that didn't belong on this busy, noisy street. It was a sound from another world. He lowered his phone, his angry expression softening into one of curiosity. A couple who had been arguing about something trivial fell silent. The woman's eyes filled with tears, though she didn't know why. The man, seeing her tears, stopped arguing and gently took her hand. They both stood there, listening, their forgotten argument dissolving in the beauty of the music. Slowly, a small crowd began to form. People emerged from nearby shops, stepped out from under awnings, drawn by the magnetic pull of the melody. They stood in the rain, some with umbrellas, some without, their faces turned toward the music shop. They didn't know who was playing. They didn't know why, but they all felt it. The music spoke a universal language. It spoke of sadness and loss, emotions that every single person in that crowd had experienced at some point in their lives. It was a shared moment of humanity on a busy street corner. The stressed-out mother, the overworked student, the lonely old man, they were all connected by the sound of the piano. Inside the shop, the man was lost in his own world. He was playing with a passion and intensity he hadn't felt in years. The music was no longer just a lament. It was evolving. It still had the deep, aching sadness, but now there was something else woven into the melody. A flicker of defiance. A memory of joy. A glimmer of hope. It was the story of a life, not just a life of sorrow, but a life of love, of triumph, of beauty. It was a symphony of the human experience, with all its highs and lows, its light and its shadows. The music swelled, growing louder and more complex, filling the shop and spilling out onto the street. The crowd outside grew larger, the people standing in a silent, reverent semicircle around the shop's window. They were no longer just random people on a street. They were an audience, captivated by the performance of a lifetime. And then, as suddenly as it had begun, the music started to fade. The complex melody simplified. The loud chords softened, and the tempo slowed. It was like a wave that had reached its peak and was now gently receding back into the ocean. He played a final, soft chord, a sound that was both a question and an answer. And then, silence. He lifted his hands from the keys and let them fall into his lap. The last note hung in the air for a long moment, a final echoing whisper, before it too disappeared. The silence that followed was different from the silence before. It was a heavy, sacred silence, thick with emotion and the memory of the music. The man sat there, his head still bowed, his chest heaving. He was exhausted, emotionally and physically drained. It felt as if he had just run a marathon. He slowly opened his eyes and looked down at his hands. They were resting on his lap, still trembling slightly. They looked like the hands of an old man, wrinkled and worn. But for the first time in a long time, they didn't feel useless. They felt alive. He slowly came back to himself, becoming aware of his surroundings. He was in a music shop. He was soaking wet. He had just played a piano he didn't have permission to touch. A wave of shame and fear washed over him. What had he done? He quickly stood up, the wooden bench scraping softly against the floor. He looked around, half expecting to see the shop owner standing there with an angry look on his face. But the shop was still empty. He could hear the muffled sounds of the crowd outside, but he didn't really register them. His only thought was to get out. He had to escape before he was discovered. He quickly backed away from the piano as if it were a fire that had just burned him. He turned and hurried to the door, his wet shoes leaving a trail of dark footprints on the polished wooden floor. He opened the door just enough to slip out, the little bell chiming his departure. He stepped back out into the rain, the cold water a shock to his heated skin. He didn't look at the crowd. He just pulled the collar of his coat up around his neck and melted into the city's flow, disappearing as quickly and quietly as he had arrived. The crowd outside stood there for a few more moments, staring at the empty shop, the beautiful music still echoing in their minds. They all had the same question on their lips. Who was that man? And the man, walking quickly through the rain-soaked streets, had a question of his own. What had he just done? He had awakened a ghost, and he had a feeling that his life would never be the same again. The rain eventually stopped, but the music it had carried lingered in the air like a fragrance. For the people who had stood on that street corner, the melody was an echo they couldn't shake. It followed them back to their offices, their homes, their lonely apartments. It was a story they needed to tell, a mystery they needed to solve. By that evening, the story of the rainy day pianist was no longer confined to a single city block. A young woman, a film student who had been among the crowd, had managed to record the last few minutes of the performance on her phone. Her hands were shaking and the video was slightly blurry. Shot through the rain-streaked window of the music shop, but the sound was clear. It was hauntingly, achingly clear. That night, sitting in her small apartment, she uploaded the video to a popular video sharing site. She didn't have many followers, and she didn't expect much to happen. She just wanted to share the beautiful, mysterious moment with someone. She titled it, simply, "The Rainy Day Pianist." She went to bed, thinking that would be the end of it. But the internet had other plans. The next morning, the video had a few hundred views. By noon, it had a few 100,000. By the time the city was heading home from work, it had millions. The video spread like wildfire, shared on every social media platform, sent in emails and text messages. It was the kind of story that the internet, usually filled with anger and noise, embraced with a surprising tenderness. News stations picked it up. Radio talk shows were flooded with calls from people who had either been there or had seen the video. The city was captivated. Who was this man? Where did he come from? How could someone who looked so broken produce something so beautiful? The comments section under the video became a digital campfire, a place for people to gather and share their feelings. "I was having the worst day of my life," one person wrote, "and I heard this music while stuck in traffic. I just sat in my car and cried. It felt like he was playing just for me," another comment read. "This music healed a part of me I didn't even know was broken. Thank you, whoever you are." People were not just curious. They were deeply moved. The mysterious pianist had become a symbol, a ghost who had voiced the collective sadness and hope of an entire city. But while the city was celebrating the mystery, the man at the center of it was trapped in a nightmare. He had spent the day after his performance in a state of deep fear and confusion. He had fled to a place he knew, a forgotten corner of a large, drafty underpass, where the sound of the traffic overhead was a constant, dull roar. He huddled there, hidden from the world, trying to understand what had happened. He had felt the music pour out of him, a force of nature he couldn't control. And for a few moments, it had felt like a release, like a dam breaking inside him. But now, all he felt was shame. He had exposed his soul, his deepest, most private pain, for anyone to see. He imagined people laughing at the crazy, dirty old man who thought he could play the piano. He imagined being arrested, dragged out of his hiding place, and publicly shamed. He didn't eat. He didn't move. He just sat there, his arms wrapped around his knees, rocking back and forth, wishing he could turn back time and never have touched that piano. Late in the afternoon, he ventured out, his hunger gnawing at him. He walked past an electronics store, and the rows of television screens in the window all showed the same thing, a blurry image of a man hunched over a piano. It was him. He froze, his heart pounding in his chest. He could hear the sound, faint but unmistakable. It was his music. It was his pain being broadcast to the world. He felt a wave of panic so strong it made him dizzy. He turned and ran, not stopping until he was gasping for breath in the narrow, familiar alleyway where he usually started his day. He was a hunted man, hunted by a ghost he had created himself. Back at the Daily Crumb, the bakery owner was closing up shop for the day. She was tired, her hands covered in a fine layer of flour. As she wiped down the counters, her phone buzzed. It was a message from her niece, with a link to a video and a note that said, "Auntie, you have to see this. This happened right near your shop." The woman sighed, expecting another funny cat video. But she clicked the link anyway. The video started to play. At first, she didn't think much of it. It was just some blurry footage of a piano. But then the music started. Her hands stopped moving. She knew that music. She had never heard it before, but she felt like she had known it her whole life. It was filled with the same profound sadness she saw every morning in the man's pale blue eyes. She leaned closer to the screen, squinting. The camera zoomed in slightly, and through the rain and the blur, she saw him. She saw the worn overcoat, the stormy gray hair, the slumped shoulders. It was him, the man who asked for nothing but bread. A gasp escaped her lips. Her hand flew to her mouth. She watched the rest of the video, her eyes wide with a mixture of shock, wonder, and a deep aching concern. When it was over, she played it again, and then again. She looked at the comments, reading the stories of the people who had been touched by his music, and she understood. She finally understood the depth of the man who stood outside her shop every morning. He wasn't just a homeless man. He was a musician, a brilliant, heartbroken musician. The next morning, the city was in a frenzy. Reporters were camped out near the music shop, hoping to catch a glimpse of the mysterious pianist. They were interviewing people on the street, asking if anyone knew anything. It was a media circus. And in the middle of it all was a young reporter, a woman with a kind face and a patient demeanor. She wasn't interested in a sensational story. She was genuinely moved by the music and wanted to know the story behind it. She was talking to the owner of the music shop, who had been just as surprised as everyone else when the bakery owner walked up to her. "Excuse me," the baker said, her voice quiet but firm. "I think I might know who you're looking for." The reporter's eyes lit up. The baker led her away from the crowd, down a side street. "He's not a bad man," the baker said, as if she needed to protect him. "He's just lost. He comes to my shop every morning." For bread, the reporter listened, her heart sinking with a strange mix of excitement and sadness. Together, they walked to the park, to the old wooden bench hidden by the oak tree, and there he was. He was sitting in his usual spot, but he was different. He looked even more haunted than usual, his shoulders hunched, his eyes darting around nervously like a cornered animal. He hadn't gone to the bakery that morning. He was too scared. The baker approached him slowly, the reporter hanging back a few feet. "It's okay," the baker said softly, her voice gentle and calm. "We're not here to hurt you." The man flinched when he saw the reporter, his face hardening. He started to get up, to run away. "Please," he said, his voice a rough, desperate whisper. "Just leave me alone." "Wait," the reporter said, taking a small step forward. She held up her phone, the screen glowing. "Just look at this, please." She didn't shove it in his face. She just held it out, giving him the choice. He hesitated, his eyes fixed on the phone. He could see the video thumbnail, the blurry image of himself. He shook his head, a look of horror on his face. "No," he choked out. "It's not what you think," the reporter said gently. "Just read the comments, please." Slowly, reluctantly, he reached out a trembling hand and took the phone. He looked at the screen, and at first, all he saw was his own image, the image of his failure and shame. But then he started to read. He read the comment from the person having the worst day of their life. He read the one from the person who felt healed. He read hundreds, then thousands, of messages from people all over the city, all over the world. People who had found comfort in his pain, people who had felt less alone because of his music. He scrolled and scrolled, his eyes moving faster and faster. He wasn't seeing the words anymore. He was feeling the emotion behind them. He was feeling the connection. And for the first time in years, the weight on his shoulders felt a little bit lighter. He looked up at the reporter, his pale blue eyes filled with tears. He saw not a journalist looking for a story, but a fellow human being looking at him with compassion. He looked at the baker, who was watching him with a look of deep, unwavering kindness, and the dam inside him broke again. But this time, it wasn't music that came out. It was words. In a quiet, halting voice, he told them everything. He told them about his life before, a life of concert halls and thunderous applause. He told them his name, a name he hadn't spoken in years. He told them about his wife, her smiling face in the front row, her love the only thing that ever truly mattered. He told them how he lost her, how the music died with her, and how he had walked away from it all. From his career, his home, his very identity. He had asked for nothing but bread because he felt he had nothing left to give. He had been a ghost, and he had expected the world to see him as one. But now, looking at the two kind women in front of him, holding the phone that contained the voices of thousands, he realized he was wrong. He had given something after all. He had given his pain, and in return, he had received a connection. He was no longer just a man who asked for bread. He was the pianist who had touched the heart of a city, and for the first time in a long, long time, he felt a flicker of something other than sorrow. He felt a glimmer of purpose. The story of the man and his music broke over the city like a tidal wave. In the days that followed, the quiet corner where he once stood invisible became the center of a storm. The little bakery, the Daily Crumb, was besieged. Phones rang off the hook, not with orders for pastries, but with requests for interviews. Television news vans with satellite dishes on their roofs lined the street, their antennas reaching for the sky like a metal forest. Reporters with microphones and cameras camped out, hoping for a glimpse, a word. Anything from the man they now called the rainy day pianist. Offers poured in from every direction. A dizzying avalanche of opportunity that felt more like a threat. A famous record label sent a courier with a contract promising a multi-album deal and an advance. That was more money than he had ever seen in his life. A national television show offered him a primetime slot on their biggest episode of the year. The city's most prestigious concert hall wanted him to be their star performer for a special charity gala. The world was holding out a glittering golden key, promising to unlock a door to fame, fortune, and a life of comfort. But the man wanted nothing to do with it. He was overwhelmed, terrified by the noise and the attention. He felt like a wild animal that had been accidentally discovered, and now everyone wanted to put him in a zoo. He stayed hidden, mostly in the small, warm kitchen of the bakery, a place that had become his sanctuary. The baker, his fierce and gentle protector, became his gatekeeper. She would stand at the back door, her arms crossed, and politely but firmly turn away the agents, the publicists, and the television producers. "He's not a product," she would tell them, her voice leaving no room for argument. "He's a person, and he needs peace." One evening, a slick, well-dressed man managed to get past the media circus and knocked on the bakery's back door. He was a high-powered agent from a big city, a man who was used to getting what he wanted. He spread out glossy brochures and a contract on the baker's flour-dusted table. He painted a picture of a future so bright it was blinding. "We're talking about sold-out arenas," the agent said, his voice smooth and convincing. "We're talking about your name on the tip of everyone's tongue. You'll never have to worry about anything ever again." The man who was sitting at the table slowly sipping a cup of tea just listened silently. He looked at the pictures of grand stages and cheering crowds. He saw the ghost of his old self, a younger man in a tuxedo, taking a bow under a shower of spotlight. He remembered the thrill of the applause, but he also remembered the emptiness that followed. He remembered the pressure to always be perfect, to always be brilliant. He remembered how the music, once his joy, had become his job, his burden. He looked up from the brochures, his pale blue eyes clear and steady. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "But that stage? It's a cage. A beautiful golden cage. But I've already spent too long in a cage of my own making. I don't want another one." The agent was stunned. He couldn't understand it. But the baker did. She smiled, a warm, knowing smile, and put a comforting hand on the man's shoulder. He had made his choice. He didn't want the world. He just wanted his music back, on his own terms. A few days later, an announcement was made, not through a press release, but through a few simple, handwritten posters that were taped up in the community center, the library, and the bakery's window. It read, "A piano performance. This Friday, 7 p.m. In the community hall, above the Daily Crumb Bakery, all are welcome. No charge. It was an invitation, not a spectacle." On the night of the performance, the community hall was filled. It wasn't a grand concert hall. It was a simple, rectangular room with scuffed wooden floors and a low ceiling. Folding chairs had been set up in neat rows, and they were all occupied. The audience was not made up of wealthy patrons or music critics. It was made up of the people from his neighborhood. There was the baker sitting in the front row, her eyes shining. There was the young reporter who had become a friend. There was the man in the expensive suit who had been shouting into his phone on the street. There was the young couple who had been arguing. They were all there, along with dozens of others, the faces he saw every day, but had never truly seen. At the front of the room, on a small, slightly out-of-tune upright piano, sat the man. He was clean-shaven, his gray hair neatly combed. He was wearing a simple, clean shirt and trousers. He looked like himself, but a version of himself that had been washed clean by the rain. He didn't say anything. He just sat down, took a deep breath, and placed his fingers on the keys. The music that filled the room was different from the music he had played in the shop. It still held the deep, resonant sadness of his journey, but now it was woven with something new. There was a warmth to it, a gentle resilience. It was the sound of a man who had walked through the darkest valley and was now seeing the first light of dawn. It was a symphony of hope, of survival, of the quiet strength of the human spirit. He played for an hour, and no one made a sound. The room was completely still, the only sounds being the music and the occasional soft sniffle from someone in the audience. When he finished, he played a final simple chord. It was a sound of peace, of acceptance. He lifted his hands from the keys and sat there for a moment, his head bowed. Then the room erupted. It wasn't the polite, restrained applause of a formal concert. It was a roar of pure, unadulterated emotion. It was a standing ovation that shook the old floorboards. It was the sound of 100 hearts, all beating in time with his, saying thank you. He stood up and turned to face them. He looked out at the sea of familiar faces, and for the first time in a very long time, he smiled. It was a small, hesitant smile, but it reached his eyes, making them crinkle at the corners. In the weeks that followed, his life settled into a new, gentle rhythm. The media frenzy eventually died down, replaced by a quiet, respectful admiration. He never signed a record deal or played a sold-out arena. Instead, he found a different kind of stage. He started volunteering at the local community center in a small room with an old piano. He began teaching music to children, kids who came from families that couldn't afford lessons. He was a patient, gentle teacher. He didn't just teach them how to read notes or press the right keys. He taught them how to feel the music, how to find their own story in the melody, how to let the piano be their voice when they had no words. He found a profound joy in passing on the gift that had saved him. He was no longer just a performer. He was a nurturer. And every morning, just as the sun began to rise, he would still stand on his corner across from the bakery. Some people would now recognize him and give him a small, respectful nod or a warm smile. He would nod back. And when the baker came out to open her shop, he would still walk across the street. "May I please have a piece of bread?" he would ask, his voice still quiet, but now with a new, lighter tone. And she would still give him the warmest loaf she had, wrapped in wax paper. He would accept it with a grateful nod. But sometimes now, he would leave something in return. On the little bench where he used to sit, he would sometimes leave a small piece of sheet paper. On it, a simple, beautiful melody would be carefully written out in neat, elegant handwriting. A small, silent gift for the woman who had given him so much more than just bread. He was no longer the ghost who asked for nothing. He was the pianist who had learned to give everything, one note, one loaf, one smile at a time. He had found his way home, not to a grand house, but to the heart of his community. He was, at last, whole.